Um, so this is all happening. As we go to press, it's still happening. Let me just ask you, Mark, because you're sitting right here with me. How do you feel at this moment as an American journalist around, here in the world, seeing how the world is reacting to what's happening in the United States and seeing this seismic drama come to a sort of a head?
Well, I mean, Christiane, I come to it as someone who, until the summer, was covering this president as a White House correspondent. And so I'm mostly thinking about the experience and what it must be like for my colleagues, all of whom have gone through this sort of unending roller coaster of drama around the president. And yet, in these final moments, it all seems almost anticlimactic. There's a sense to which, for however momentous this occasion is and how historic it is, events were leading almost ineluctably to this conclusion. So I'm sort of struck by both the weight of history that lies over this moment, but the sense to which you could have said a year ago that perhaps we would see this outcome, and you see it in this sort of odd lack of drama surrounding these final debates. On both sides, you're hearing arguments that we've now heard so many times that the odds of a surprise or an unexpected development at this point are really very low, and we're all waiting just for the inevitable vote to occur.
Rich Lowry, you run a conservative newspaper. You obviously, are conservative. How does it make you feel to see this conservative American president being impeached, but also react to what Mark just said? It has a feel of inevitability, which is kind of what Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, was saying, but in a different way, that actually this has been the Democrats' aim from the very, very beginning, and the facts be damned. What is your view?
Well, it's obviously a historic vote in the sense this be the third time it's happened in American history that a president's been impeached by the House. But otherwise, there's very little drama to it, and there'll probably be very little consequence to it. The fact is, this is not convulsing the nation. Part of the reason we're on this time frame here is that the House is desperate to get it off of its plate and get on to something else. And even the Democratic presidential candidates who, it's their business to have their fingers on the pulse of Democratic voters out in the hustings, they're not talking about this very much. So this is not a climax. It's not an end. It's just another skirmish in the long war over Trump. And if you look at some of the polls, you'll get some polls that show support for impeaching and removing 48%, opposition 46%, which are two numbers that sound very familiar because they're exactly the popular vote margins for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016, which shows that very few people have moved. And I think just in terms of presidential politics, as soon as he's acquitted in the Senate, which will also be inevitable, 2 weeks later, this will feel like something like everything else that happened a decade ago and will have very little effect on what happens in November 2020.
And so let me ask you, Susan, before we dive down into the polarization of what it might mean for the future. President Trump has written that very long letter to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, about a 6-page letter saying that history will judge you. He says, I write this letter to you for the purpose of history and to put my thoughts on a permanent and indelible record. 100 years from now, when people look back at this affair, I want them to understand it and learn from it so that it can never happen to another president again. How do you think, Susan, and you've been watching it very closely, history will judge this?
Well, Christiane, I'm standing here up on Capitol Hill for this debate, and, the weary cynicism that you're hearing from the other guests about, we presume to know the inevitable outcome. History does get the last laugh here. Even to listen to that Donald Trump quote, I think the problem that we all face as journalists is, one individual quote taken out of context can make Donald Trump sound like so much more of a rational actor, and, that he fits somehow within the mainstream of our epic clash between Republicans and Democrats. History is going to regard that letter as an astonishing sequel to, great presidential works of, oratory, and, it's filled with exclamation points, with grievance, with laments, with factual inaccuracies that, really are as good of a summing up of the presidency so far as almost anything else. And I take the point that for a momentous occasion today, it feels a little bit lacking in energy up here in the Capitol, although I imagine later today, as we get closer to the votes this evening, it'll be much more packed with people, members sitting on the floor listening to speeches and the like. But again, to the point about history, it seems to me that one of the reasons that this just feels like one more chapter, as Rich put it, in the ongoing Trump saga, is because Trump himself, in many ways, is the crisis. It's not the Ukraine affair that we're likely to regard as the most significant thing about Trump, but the nature of his presidency itself, I think.
I want to get to the facts, actually, because it's so strange that facts themselves are completely and utterly debated and disagreed with along party lines. You just heard, Governor Scott Walker talk about how there's been no evidence whatsoever to suggest that any of this is justified. But let us just play one of the president's chief people, his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who, as we speak, has been going back and forth from Ukraine and appeared last night on Fox News to give yet another doubling down of how he forced out Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch in this affair. Let us play this soundbite.
You're a personal attorney for the president, so why do you need her out of the way?
I didn't need her out of the way. I forced her out because she's corrupt. It's documentary evidence that she committed perjury. I have 4 witnesses who will testify that she personally turned down their visas because they were going to come here and give evidence either against Biden or against the Democratic Party. There's no question that she was acting corruptly in that position and had to be removed. She should have been fired if the State Department weren't part of the deep state.
I mean, it's just actually incredible to listen to that, because it just does go all over the place. And it somewhat contradicts what he said to the New Yorker, which was that I had to get her out because she was obstructing me being able to dig up dirt for my client being the president. So I guess, Mark Landler, when we're trying to tell these stories and report the facts to people about what's actually going on, it's very difficult, isn't it, when you're dealing with this?
Well, one of the interesting things about the calculation the Democrats made when they started down this road was that, unlike the Mueller report, which was extremely complicated, 440 pages, this notion of the president calling the president of Ukraine and asking for a quid pro quo was a relatively easy thing. People would understand that this happened and it was wrong. It was an abuse of his power. That was a couple of months ago. Look where we are now. Rudy Giuliani's explanation now is so tangled, so serpentine, that you can easily lose track of who did what to whom and whether it was right or wrong. And I think to the extent that the president has been successful in repelling this whole effort, he has managed to kick up a great deal of guerrilla dust. And that original notion of a phone call made on improper grounds and abuse of authority has sort of been lost in the mist, even though, as you said earlier, his own ambassador to the EU basically said it, others testified to it. So I think one of the things that is very difficult in this time we're living in of deep polarization is keeping a narrative, and keeping a narrative that's based on the facts and not based on counterclaims that in many cases are spurious, wildly exaggerated, invented out of whole cloth. I think that the Democrats have only been moderately successful in doing that. And in the early stages of the testimony, it seemed like they did have a sequence of witnesses that were laying out an evidentiary trail. But I think in the last few weeks, we sort of lost that a little bit. And the debate once again became hopelessly tangled. And to the extent it's tangled, it plays to the president's advantage.
And Rich Lowry, I mean, the Democrats have been unified, but as Mark points out, slightly tangled, and in these endless days of debate that's televised, around the world. But also so have the Republicans, right? I mean, the Republicans have been very unified. They've absolutely got into lockstep behind the president, to the point that Mitch McConnell has basically admitted that he's not an impartial juror. Let me just play this, and I'm going to get your reaction to it in a moment.
I'm not an impartial juror. This is a political process. There's not anything judicial about it. Impeachment is a political decision. The House made a partisan political decision to impeach. I would anticipate we will have a largely partisan outcome in the Senate. I'm not impartial about this at all.
How do you feel about that, sitting stateside, Rich Lowry? And of course, you know, the senators all have to take an oath saying, I solemnly swear I'll do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws.
Yeah, well, I don't think Mitch McConnell thinks he's going to do anything to violate the Constitution or the laws, but he's absolutely right. This is a political process with legal trappings. But we don't, the founders didn't devise a system where you go out and create a jury the way you usually do. You find people who know nothing about this, have no opinion about it, and ask them to decide. It's inherently a political process, so you have elected, they weren't elected at the time of the founding, but you have elected senators, the ultimate arbiters. And I think it's also ridiculous just to pretend that partisanship goes one way here. It's been a partisan impeachment in the House, and it'll be a partisan acquittal in the Senate. And this is not anything new in American history. You have a very small sample size of prior Senate trials of presidents who were impeached, but never in those previous two trials did any party did any member of the same party as the impeached president vote to convict him. And we're probably not going to have that this time either. I expect there'll be 0 Republican votes to convict.
Oh, so that's interesting, of course, and a good reminder. Susan Glasser, he will be, he's likely to be the first impeached president by the House to run for re-election. Let's now get into the whole polarization of the state of politics, where you are, where we are here in London. I mean, just what happens after this? I mean, does it just both sides dig in even further? Is there any way that a country will be healed?
Well, Christian, Donald Trump, as you know, is not, that's not his brand in politics. He's not a healer. He's not, as Bill Clinton once aspired to be, a repairer of the breach. What's striking, in fact, to me, I was here 21 years ago, almost to the day, when Bill Clinton was impeached by the House and then was sent to the Senate for a trial. And, you know, Bill Clinton took a different tack. It was a different time in our politics. He felt that he needed to apologize. He gave quite a contrite speech. He said he did wrong. Democrats like the Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle essentially said the president did wrong. You know, we don't believe his crimes rose to the level of removing him from office. But it was a very different defense of Bill Clinton. They didn't argue essentially over the facts once Bill Clinton admitted that he lied under oath. What happened is that they made a constitutional and legal argument about what it is that Congress should do about that. And here we have a situation where Republicans refuse not only to accept basic facts about it, but even Donald Trump talks about his perfect phone call, which he released. That remains the key bit of evidence. And I was just blown away the other day, to your point about the two sides not accepting facts anymore, Christian. There's a Congresswoman, Debbie Lesko from Arizona, from the Judiciary Committee. After the Judiciary Committee approved the 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump, she came out to the cameras and a reporter asked her, well, Congresswoman, you know, do you really think it's appropriate for the President of the United States to ask the president of another country to investigate Joe Biden? And she said he didn't say that. And the reporter pointed out, well, it's literally in the transcript of the phone call that the White House itself released. And she said, no, he didn't say that. And so, you know, what are you going to do in a situation like that? You're not going to repair the breach that has opened up to be a chasm in American society. There's an 85-point gap, according to the Wall Street Journal today, between the two parties' views of Donald Trump. During President Carter's era, that was 16 points. So the chasm is widening, and 2020, look out. It's going to get wider still.
And Mark, having been a White House correspondent, you just heard Susan refer to Tom Daschle, who was the Senate Democratic leader at the time of the Clinton impeachment. And he said, actually, as deeply disappointed as I am with the process, it pales in comparison to the disappointment I feel towards this president. So here was a major Democratic leader actually slapping the president, at least somewhat. Can you imagine that happening at all in this case?
Well, there were 1 or 2 Republicans who suggested that they were going to be open-minded about it, and some who were quite critical of the president in the early days when the first disclosures of all this came out. Mitt Romney was an obvious example. Even Lindsey Graham, if you recall, said he would be troubled if there was clear evidence of a quid pro quo. Well, lo and behold, there was clear evidence of a quid pro quo, and Lindsey Graham clearly doesn't feel that way anymore. I mean, I'm also struck by, speaking of Republican senators, if you go back to the 1970s, merely the prospect of impeachment was enough to send a group of very senior Republican senators to the White House to tell President Richard Nixon that he didn't have their support anymore and precipitated his resignation. So it goes without saying that the world and our politics have changed extraordinarily. And I think Rich is probably right that not a single Republican senator will vote to convict the president.
So, Rich, let me ask you, because, you know, you are editor-in-chief of the National Review. Back in 2016, there was the, quote, no Trump issue when he was running as candidate. And you wrote, Trump is a philosophically unmoored political opportunist who would trash the broad conservative ideological consensus within the GOP in favor of a free-floating populism with strongman overtones. Have your views changed since then?
Yes and no. I think we've seen a lot of the downsides, the way he behaves himself, what he says. The old conservative consensus obviously is under philosophical and ideological stress within the party. But I've been surprised by two things. One, on kind of core issues important to the conservative coalition, life issues, conscience rights, judges. Trump's been an absolute rock, which is something I never would have expected. And then I've been wrong on the other side of the ledger, where I thought he would attempt to moderate his behavior somewhat, to hide his grievances, not to air them constantly on Twitter. And he does. And that's just a major downside. And when we ran that issue, you know, there were 16 Republicans in a primary, and we thought there were, you know, 10, 12 better alternatives than Donald Trump. The fact is now he's president of the United States, and there aren't any good alternatives that I can see.
I just want to further ask you, I mean, to comment, I mean, almost like sort of, you know, jovially, I want to ask you to respond to your colleague John Harris, who is the editor at Politico. And he wrote an article headlined Impeachment and the Crack-Up of the Conservative Mind. And he says he'd like to hear from any supporter of President Trump who, A, believes sincerely that impeachment is illegitimate, and who also, at the same time, can convincingly say that they would argue against impeachment if the facts were exactly the same, but it was Hillary Clinton in the White House. Are you that elusive conservative, Rich?
Well, one thing that I've said from the very beginning, and I think Republicans would be much stronger ground if they just admitted the call wasn't perfect, obviously, and he was obviously withholding this money to pressure the Ukrainians to commit to these investigations, and that was an improper use of his power. And I think it'll come back to haunt Republicans that they haven't said these things forthrightly when they're arguing against abuses by a future Democratic president. That said, I sincerely believe, and I think pretty much every Republican senator sincerely believes, that this is just too narrow and tenuous a grounds to remove a president for the first time in our history. So this will end up serving the way the Clinton impeachment did in the 1990s as an act of censure, and perhaps we'll all be better going forward, each party, each side having done this, if in the future we think about censure votes rather than impeachment.
And I guess final word to you, Susan. We literally only have 30 seconds. Do you think that that would be a way forward?
Well, Christian, you know, censure came up in the Clinton impeachment. It's already come up here. It's been rejected. I think the two parties are too firmly entrenched for that to happen. But, you know, look, it's a remarkable thing that every single Republican House member and every single Republican senator's conscience happens to line up so perfectly, you know, with the president's interest at this moment in time. That is, let's just say, a statistically improbable event. You know, the bottom line is that these moments are moments of reckoning. When we look at just where our political system is at, there's always been hypocrites, there's always been liars in Washington. I've never seen anything like this. I have to tell you, it's a tough time for American democracy, truthfully.
On that note, and there's so much more to talk about, and we will as we carry on. But anyway, Susan Glasser, Rich Lowry, and also Mark Landler, thank you so much for being with us tonight.